Alright, here's a demo. Here's a demo on how you actually start the Angular architecture. You need to not open the index.html and double click it. It's an actual framework. It's not. It has a server. You need to boot up the server. You can't just double click it like D3. Like D3 shit is garbage. Like I don't even know why they teach it like that. So ls actually gives you all the directives that you're currently in. I'm obviously at the higher level above desktop, so I can see my applications or whatever. So what I'm going to do is actually go into cd, lets me go into an area. So I'm doing cd.desktop to go into my desktop. If I do ls, it shows me everything, all the folders that are on my desktop level. I'm going to cd back into support. Then I'm going to ls again, and as you can see here, I have my package.json as well as my server.js. When you're first starting out, you're going to do npm.package npm install package.json. Make sure that you installed your node servers online, and npm install node or whatever. You need to install node in order to have access to the npm package manager for Node.js. Once you have access to that, then you can do npm install package.json and install all the dependencies that are associated with your project. Afterwards, you're going to do node server.js, and it's going to boot up your server. It's going to be running on port 8002. So what you need to do is go into localhost 8002 on your browser, and there you're going to see whatever you're trying to see right now. So as you can see here, this is kind of what our Microsoft project homepage looks like, and as you can see here in your controller, it has all your factories and whatnot in your console.log. So the next thing you're going to do is actually we're going to go over the code itself. Okay, so as you can see here, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this here. Okay, as you can see, I actually went back and modularized their code, so we have a few different sets of partials right now. So partials are, remember, partials are everything that's kind of like Ajax loaded, kind of like preloaded, like portions of an HTML page, so you don't have to reload the entire thing. So I created one for dimensions, which is kind of like this section over here. Then I created a partial for header, because the header is this section, and like these are kind of not related, because I can inject the header into any single page that I have, and I don't need to recopy the code or remake the code 9 times for every pages that I have. So I only need to make it once, and if I need it, I can inject it. So that's why it's modularized like that. So dimensions, it's its own thing. And the thing is, like, dimensions is always going to populate own data, like all the data depending on whatever you're going to have over here, whatever entities you're going to click, the data is going to be populated, it's going to be different for each one, and they're not necessarily kind of relate to each other at the beginning until they actually click on it. That's why they separate them into partials. I also use Bootstrap, which is a 12-column grid system, so that there's responsiveness kind of built into it already to an extent. So if you go into here, you do this stuff, it's responsive to an extent. As you can see, it just stacks. Okay, it kind of breaks over at this point, but it's responsive enough for the most part for our needs, because this is primarily going to be a desktop application anyway. So as you can see, it changes depending on the usage. You would use this on mobile. Mobile, it looks like this, but again, like, you're never going to use this on mobile, so it doesn't make sense. Like, this is the best you would ever. This is probably the lowest you would ever go, and like that's all we need to do before we go into account for every single breakpoint. That's just not time efficient. Anyway, so I have entity mapping, which is our initial page right now. So notice that you have to go to app.js, and then you have to set different addresses for different URL points, and you have to actually specify which controller is actually handling the logic for that particular HTML. So as you can see here, entity mapping and dimensions.html, these two partials are controlled by input controller. If I want any data that be manipulated or parsed or whatever fucking whatever, then I would input that logic into that controller, and it would handle all of that. Input factory just handles the data. So again, factory is just pulling all the JSON data into a bulk. Your controllers are actually parsing the data logic, and whatever, and feeding into your HTML partial. So in my factory, I have one big JSON call that calls all the test.json or whatever. Since we don't have an API, we just use mock data, and as you can see in my test.json, actually reorganized the mock data that Foundling created, and I kind of restructured it so it's easier to test. So obviously, if we have a million different fucking data points, it's gonna be hard to visualize that. So if we visualize that with 2 data points each, or 2 objects in each fucking entity, then it's a lot easier to kind of visualize and manage than test. So as you can see here, I have header.css, dimensions.css, and each of these relate to the HTML. So dimensions HTML has dimensions CSS. We're working with test.json. So as you can see in your input.factory, this API call is just calling from the source of this test JSON file, and then packaging up as a response variable. As you can see here in my controller.entity, so as you can see here, depending on what call I'm doing, I'm manipulating the data to an extent. In my first call for get, data.json or whatever, I have pretty much everything. I'm pulling everything, right? So I'm just whatever I got from the response variable, I'm putting into datum. Datum now is some kind of scope variable, which the HTML has access to for two-way data binding. And as you can see here, I have access to all of that in the front end, and I can just call it whatever I want. So an entity.frontend, entity mapping.frontend. I have click variable. So basically, when I have ng submit, it's gonna run this function called ic.getJSON. And technically, I don't need to make it a form. I could have just made it a link. I could have just made entity and h1 tag or something and made it a link where it calls this function. So IC stands for input controller, and inside input controller is a function called getJSON, which is over here. So as you can see here, I'm over here. I have all the my header, my side for like the fucking graphs and shit, and like other additional data. You click on entity, it's gonna parse through that big datum.json, and all it's gonna do is actually just pull out. I believe it's just doing key value, so it's actually just gonna take out all the keys, like the higher level keys of every object inside. So as you can see here, when you get that huge JSON file at the beginning in test.json, it's actually just gonna iterate through and get the keys of each object. So as you can see here, continent, country, state, city, and stuff like that. But obviously, you're just getting the entity types, and then there's different entity properties inside each one as well. So if that's the case, then you can probably write a more dynamic logic. So you have to iterate through. You would probably have to iterate and get the key of each one, and then you would have to click and whatever, and then iterate through the objects inside each one again, and then vice versa. You would have to keep doing that. And because we don't know how much data is inside, the stuff that Microsoft's working with, because like each entity and entity type have different sets of. Each entity would have different entity types, a different number of entity types, as well as a different number of properties. We can't have a fixed value for our weather data because we know exactly what it is, and there's only 2 data points and it's static. We could do that, but we need to make it dynamic, and we need to make it more ambiguous so that it can parse through each one. So that's why it has to be like an if-else child loop or something like that, where it's like if there's children inside an entity, keep showing all the entities, and then inside each entity type, keep showing all the number of properties and show all the values of each property and etc. or whatnot. It's not exactly clear how he wants us to visualize it, but I thought whatever Andre had at the beginning made a little bit more sense, so it's better to show him what we have. So as of right now, we have it, so it's like continent, and if you click on continent, it actually, so as you can see here, I don't really need the submit function. I could just go into ng-click, and obviously when I do like ng-click, it's dynamically generating me like kind of like the key values that are the entity types. I click on continent or whatever, and it's going to trigger this get child.data function. So if I go into my controller for input.json or whatever, as you can see here, okay, then what it's going to do is actually just we're not going to call the API again because scope.data has all the raw objects, so we're just going to manipulate whatever the objects are. So obviously I would just click on continent and just be like, hey, create a new array or create a new list, and then create a new array and basically just be like, hey, scope out this new list is going to contain the datum.continent. So anything that's all the objects inside the continent array is what I'm going to be setting this child.data array to. So now when I go back to my my dimensions.html, which is the side where it's showing all the data, it would be like child inside child data, which is kind of like child data is obviously this array right here, and this array has all the things that are related to continent. So when I do child and child data, and then do child like this, it's just going to iterate through each continent, or each of the objects inside continent, and it'll show me all the property types. So as you can see here, these are all related to continent. And this might be a way that he might be looking for, but obviously it has to be more dynamic and it has to be able to kind of traverse and go through different layers. But all I did right now is kind of like set up a framework and kind of like just demo the different methods on how it should be used. You need to make it a little bit more dynamic, but this is how all the things are kind of connected and talking to each other. So it should be relatively easy now. So if you go into your input controller, you have to make this logic a little bit more ambiguous and more 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 dynamically generated versus static, where it's like I'm doing data.content right now, where it would have to be like data.child or something like that. It'd be like maybe like I don't know, like I.index or something like that, and then like something like index. I don't know, fuck, it's like index plus I or something like that, right? Where it's like it has to be more dynamic, where like depending on what it is and how many children it has, it's gonna keep doing it for each one. So as you can see here, that's kind of like the next step where we need to have a dynamically generated parsing algorithm that we make, where it just continuously looks through stuff until there isn't stuff. It's a simple if else loop, you just stack over for it. Next thing we need to do would be to D3 kind of visualize anything that has time. So like time dimension or variable, we would always do an XY two-dimensional graph. It's always gonna be like a bar chart or some kind of line chart. It's always gonna be a line chart most likely because it's time, right? So that's fairly easy to do because if you do it once, you just redo it again with different variables. So ultimately, this should take about like 3 days, maybe tops, to do the rest of the entire project. You should be fine. So we have Bootstrap, we have basic styling, we have a Angular architecture, and we have D3. Like that's pretty much what we need to do. It should take about 3 days. So all right, that's it. A lot of people had a few questions, so I just made this quick video before my exam to just stop asking questions, just watch the video.